Well, last week, of course, we looked at chapter 10 and the nations that descended from the three sons of Noah. And now in chapter 11, we're told how those nations became dispersed over all of the earth. For us, chapters 10 and 11 may seem to be in the wrong order to us, because we tend to think of things chronologically or linearly, but the Bible doesn't always follow a chronological order. It isn't always linear in the way that it tells its story. In fact, quite often it doesn't follow a chronological order. And there is this pattern in the Bible where it's called the pattern of recurrence, or the law of recurrence, where an event is mentioned and then it's repeated, and when it's mentioned the second time, more details are given. So you kind of have this general introduction, and then greater detail is given of the account later on. And that's what you have here with chapters 10 and 11. So chapter 11 now tells us how these nations were dispersed over all the earth. We're told in verse 1 that everyone on the earth at this time spoke the same language. It says the whole earth had one language. And we know that the one language that everyone spoke was English, right? Because we speak English, so they must have spoke English too. It just makes sense. No, we don't really know what that one language was that everyone spoke. Some believe it was Hebrew, and a pretty good case could be made, pretty good argument could be made that it was probably Hebrew, primarily because all of the names mentioned in the prior chapters in Genesis are all Hebrew names. All of the word plays that we find in the earlier chapters of Genesis only make sense in Hebrew. They don't really make sense in any other language. But we can't say for certainty that everyone spoke Hebrew. We don't know what that one language was that everyone spoke. But it says that all mankind had one language, and then verse 1 again, it says they all had one speech. And one speech means everyone used the same vocabulary and the same meaning for words. Of course, you know that within a language you can have different dialects. Some of the people in our church are linguists, and they know this, that within a single language you might have different dialects, and words can have different meanings within that language and within those different dialects. Even for us, the English that we speak here in the United States is very different from the English that people speak, say, in Scotland. And some of the words that we use have different meanings, and some of the words that Scottish people use have different meanings from the words that we use. And so, but what we're told here is at this time on the earth, not only did they have one language, but it was one speech. So everybody's speaking the same language on the earth. This is one of the things that I love about the Bible, is that it tells us things like this. If you've ever wondered, where did all the languages come from? Why do we have so many languages on the earth? I know when I was a new believer and kind of reading through the Bible for the first time and coming to passages like Genesis 11, I appreciated them. I was amazed by them, to know, so this is where all the languages came from. This is how all the nations came into being on the earth. Maybe that's just me. So verse 2 says, "And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east," your translation might say toward the east, "that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there." So after the flood, the descendants of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they began to migrate away from Ararat, where the ark landed, and they journeyed from the east until they came to a plain in the land of Shinar, and it says they dwelt there. Now the name Shinar, it means the country of two rivers. and it's the land between the Tigris and Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq. And so when the people got to the land of Shinar, they stopped, and they decided to stay there in Shinar instead of continuing to disperse and migrate across the earth. Now, why is this important? Why are we told this? Well, I want you to think back with me to the very first commandment that God gave to Adam and Eve, and that commandment was to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth with people. And God repeated that command to Noah's family in chapter 9, verse 1, and God told Noah's family to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so people began to spread out on the earth and fill it, but when they got to the land of Shinar, they stopped. And they decided to dwell there and stay in Shinar. If you look at verse 3, it says, Then they said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. This is the Tower of Babel. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. You see what happens here? They stopped in the land of Shinar and they said, let's build a city right here. Let's build a tower, Tower of Babel, up to heaven. And they decide, we're going to stay here instead of being scattered all over the earth like God has commanded us to do. In the building of the city of Babel and the building of the Tower of Babel is significant, and it's significant for two reasons. First of all, this is mankind's first attempt to create a civilization that excludes God and exalts man. This is where it begins. When man makes the decision to create a society, create a civilization that excludes God and exalts mankind. You know, last weekend in our country, we celebrated our independence, the 4th of July. 244 years ago, we declared our independence from Great Britain. And here in Genesis chapter 11, man declares his independence. Not from a nation, but from God. Man declares his independence from God. This is, blatant, arrogant rebellion on the part of mankind against God. It's here at Babel that mankind rejects God's command, rejects God's agenda, rejects God's authority, and tries to create a society without God. And since Genesis chapter 11, mankind has attempted to create countries and governments and societies that exclude God and exalt mankind. And this rebellion that we see here against God's authority, the Bible tells us it's going to reach its highest point in human history in the last days under the Antichrist. The Antichrist, of course, is this world leader who will come on the scene, and the Antichrist will unite all of the world governments and create one world government and one world system that will be under his authority, and God's authority will be rejected. And what started here at Babel will find its greatest reality, its fullest reality, under the Antichrist in the last days. And that's where things are moving in the world. They're moving toward that. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4, it says, of the Antichrist, he will exalt himself and defy everything that people call God and every object of worship. He will even sit in the temple of God, claiming that he himself is God. So the Antichrist will create a world government that excludes God, and the Antichrist will exalt himself, and mankind will be exalted under this system that will be created, where now man replaces God and rules without God. And we already see that at work in the world, right? I mean, the Bible tells us the spirit of Antichrist is already at work in the world. We already see God being pushed out of societies. We already see God being pushed out of government. God pushed out of public life. God's commands pushed out. God's commands pushed aside. It all begins back in Genesis chapter 11.